Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And the sort of return from holiday has meant that my reading has been my brain has apparently not caught up, but it's been a fun set of readings, so let's talk a little bit about those, and I hope you're all having a great week. First, to start off with quite a fun book in many ways, AJ West with The Betrayal of Thomas True. And this is one that I definitely recommend on audiobook, or at least that's how I read it. I'm assuming the physical version is great as well, but the audiobook really added something for me, I think. The story, in many ways, it feels like almost like Oliver Twist as a story, but very gay. Is kind of my one-line description. And what I mean by that is Thomas True is this character who's sort of a transplant in a kind of, I think it's the 1700s London. And he kind of appears and is this sort of figure who's trying to get around and just kind of find identity, find belonging. And quite early into the book, he finds himself in various molly houses in London. And molly houses, sort of their history is quite a rich and varied one, but essentially they were some combination of sometimes brothels or sort of something of the like, but often a big part of it was essentially people who we would maybe now see as gay or bisexual men having a safe place to be, and often they would dress and perform or sort of present themselves as these sort of grande dame kind of figures, and we see a lot of those in this book, of these quite frankly ridiculous but wonderful characters, essentially like these very almost like high camp, high drag kind of figures walking around being like, you know, just sort of making sort of lewd and sexual comments and all this other stuff. They are hilarious in this book. I don't know quite how much he would have had to sort of research to sort of do that specifically, but it feels very much like this sort of bawdy backroom kind of humor of these sort of grande dame figures, of these sort of these mollies, and it's great. Apart from that, there's a wider story here of Thomas True as this figure trying to find out a little bit more about his own life, and there's a sort of really dynamic plot in the background about this betrayal that is sort of in the title of the book. I found it really entertaining. I thought this was just such good fun, and just one of those books that's just a joy to read. It's just really silly and fun and funny and so many other things. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. On a significantly different note, I read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, and this is obviously a sort of this historical classic kind of novel, and I'm sort of mostly reading it. Well, I kind of wanted to read it anyway. I really enjoyed the Death in Venice, Death in Venice rather, by him, and I'm sort of reading this as a sort of preamble to reading The Impusium by Olga Tokarczuk, which is sort of based off it. From what I understand, you don't need to have read The Magic Mountain to read The Impusium, but I kind of just wanted to because I'd been wanting to read the book anyway. And it's essentially a story set in a sort of recuperation center, a kind of a place where people go in the sort of the mountains of I believe Switzerland, I think it was, to rest and recover from various illnesses. And so it's this sort of, you know, that old tradition, particularly of this sort of very much in the 18th and 19th centuries, and a bit into the 20th century as well, of these rest cures, of people going out to the mountains or to the lakes to recover from various illnesses. And what I think kind of comes up that's quite interesting about this is just the way this book examines what it means to be ill, or what it means to be seen as okay in a society that often these figures are people who don't necessarily belong, or there is something complicated about them where it's easy for their behaviors to be pathologized, and so for them going to sort of the lakes or to the mountains to be part of a rest cure is in some ways slightly divorced from the reality as well of their situations. So I found it just a really beautiful and interesting book in many ways. It is quite a long one, but I think there's something about the kind of precision of this writing style, this kind of very much, I'm going to tell you this big story, that really sort of delivers this sort of examination of sort of social attitudes and sort of social sort of placings, I guess, of that time. And so I thought this was a really, really interestingly done book. Next up, one of two Fitzcarraldo books I read this week. The first being Tell by Jonathan Buckley. And this was recently shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize, and I can see why. It's a very playful book. It really, I think, develops what narratives can do in a really exciting way. The core idea is a man has gone missing, and a woman who used to work for him is being interviewed. And so all of the book is delivered as transcripts of an interview. And it reminded me in some ways of a couple of video games that have done this really well. So I think, I can't remember, I think it's called Herstory. There's a video game where it's done only through interview transcripts and you have to sort of piece together things. In that video game, it plays around with time. But with this book, I think what's kind of, it's mostly sequential, it's mostly in order, but we do have separate sessions, you know, almost the parts of the book are sessions. And so we do get an idea of where the interviewee is able to stop, formulate her thoughts and come back and think about it again and say, well, actually, I don't think I was right there. We have occasional bits where essentially bits of text are missing because something was inaudible or there's a skip in the tape or something like that. And so we have these little fragments that are missing. But for the most part, we are being told a story. But what's really interesting is the book then darts around and plays with this to kind of deliver this idea of, well, actually, how reliable are stories? If somebody is telling you a thing that happened, how much can we fully trust that? Is this just a, you know, in many ways, much of storytelling is trying to imagine ourselves in other people's heads. But actually, we can think about motivations. We can think about why this person did a certain thing or how they might have gone missing, but we don't know. We're kind of just speculating based on patterns of behavior and various other things. And so I think this book does some really clever things in building that argument of we don't really know much, and we're in many ways just reading evidence. We're just reading transcripts and trying to piece together something of people we don't know, which in many ways most novels are. But in a lot of novels, there's an authorial voice that kind of tells you where you're going. And it kind of says, hey, look, this person is this kind of person and this thing happened to them. Whereas here, because we're just listening to transcripts, we're having to read between the lines of, well, actually, did that thing happen? Does this make sense? Would this person have a motivation to lie about this? All of these sorts of things. And I think it's really clever as a result of the way this book plays with narrative. And I really enjoyed what the book was doing to slightly put you on the back foot as a reader to not fully know exactly what the truth might be. And I think it's a really well done book for that reason. Last but not least, I read Intervals by Marianne Brooker. And this was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction this year. And I kept on meaning to read it, and it took me ages and ages to get around to it. But I eventually read it. And it's a really powerful piece of non-fiction writing, I think. It essentially takes as the core part of this a story about Marianne Brooker and her mother, and particularly her mother's declining health. And it sort of as a result becomes a conversation about care work, about the infrastructure around care and various other things. It also touches on essentially things around assisted dying and various other conversations around it. So it's dealing with these really weighty topics, but it's also dealing with a really beautiful personal narrative. And I think somehow both of them shine without feeling over the top in this book. As in, I don't think this feels like a heavy essay about care, nor does it feel like a really intense personal story. I think both are allowed to breathe and to inform each other. And so what this ends up being is a sort of almost very clear-headed, pragmatic view of care and assisted dying and various other things through the lens of somebody who's lived it. And it's quite a hard feat, I think, to achieve, because the book doesn't hover around in sentimentality much, even though that's always there. You know, there's always you know, in sort of thinking about her mother's life, that's going to naturally come up. But I think this book does some really clever things in kind of using that as context for everything else it's saying. And I think it's really at its best when it dwells on the little moments of understanding and of love between her and her mother, but also where it kind of argues for what the future could look like, and what, you know, things are in place that make this easier or harder for carers. I think it's a really beautifully done book, and I think it's just, I can see why it was picked up by the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, but I think this is a really stunning piece of writing. So those are the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a good week. I hope things are going well. I'm slightly both overlit and underlit by whatever's going on weather-wise in the UK. Slightly sweaty. It's very sunny and warm somehow as well. I hope you're keeping well. I hope things are good. And yeah, I hope reading is going well too. I'm slowly chugging along with my Booker project. I've sort of taken my eye off the prize ever so slightly, but we'll pick back up. I'm kind of just finishing off the last book from the Goldsmiths shortlist, and reading from a few other little prizes, but there will be various Booker and various other prize things coming. I didn't manage to get out a video this Wednesday. It was just one of those weeks. But I will be back shortly with another little video. I hope you're keeping well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.